Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear guests, I am Uwe Hartmann, and I have the great pleasure of moderating the first panel of our conference. This panel is dedicated to the topic of dealing with Jewish property after the liberation in 1945. Over the next 90 minutes, 3 speakers will outline the historical processes in 3 European regions. At first, the situation in Hungary, an ally of Nazi Germany when the Soviet army had marched in. Then, the view to Lower Silesia, which now in 1945, belonged to the territory of the Polish state. And finally, we will be given an overview of developments in post-war Czechoslovakia, the first victim of Hitler's plans for aggression. Dear guests, dear colleagues, if you would like to ask the speakers questions, you can do so after the presentations. Please use the microphone set up here in the hall for this purpose. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Mrs. Klacsmann as the first speaker. Borbála Klacsmann is an expert in the history of the Hungarian Holocaust and the restitution and compensation of Holocaust survivors. She completed her doctoral studies at the Department of History at the University of Szeged in 2021. Currently, she is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the War Studies in the University College of Dublin. Previously, she had worked for the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest, the Anne Frank House, and the Yad Vashem archives. She is also the editorial assistant of the Eastern European Holocaust Studies and the owner and editor of the Facebook history blog Holocaust 13 Netek. I hope it's what right in Hungarian, in English, Holocaust Stories. Her volume with the same title was published in May 2023. Borbála Klacsmann, welcome in Berlin.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to the German Lost Art Foundation for inviting me. And I think I might be the odd one here because I'm not a provenance researcher or a museum staff member, but I did my PhD on the restitution and compensation of Hungarian Jewish survivors in Pest County, which is around the capital, Budapest. And as the cultural minister said, I was more interested in the personal stories, like how people managed to recuperate their assets, what did they manage to get back, what didn't they manage to get back. And for this presentation today, I picked some case studies which were about, as I sensed, which were about cultural assets. But first of all, in the first half of my presentation, I will talk about the historical background because I'm quite sure that not many people are familiar with Hungarian history here. So let's start with this map here, which shows you Hungary in 1944. What you need to know is that Regent Miklós Horthy came to power in Hungary at the end of 1919, and he was in power until 1944. And under his rule, major anti-Jewish laws were enacted from 1938. These restricted Jewish presence in liberal professions and the economic fields, and Jewish land property was Aryanized, and marriage between Jews and non-Jews was forbidden. On the 19th of March in 1944, Germany occupied Hungary because they sensed that Miklós Horthy wanted to jump out of the war and join the Allied forces. And it was very important that Hungary stays on the German side. Miklós Horthy, the regent, stayed in office and he appointed a German-friendly new government. And in mid-April, the ghettoization started. We will soon have actually the Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the 16th of April when the first ghetto was set up. And from mid-May, the deportation started. And until the 8th of July, approximately 437,000 Jews were deported, mainly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Able-bodied men were drafted to military labor service, therefore most of the deportees were women, children, and the elderly. During this time, thousands of non-Jewish Hungarians took over Jewish businesses, real estates, shops, movables. They looted Jewish houses and shops, or those were redistributed to non-Jews. And several institutions were involved in the persecution and the confiscation of Jewish property, which resulted in a post-war chaos, basically, because at the end of the war, approximately 200,000 survivors stayed or came back to Hungary, and most of them lived in poverty, and they needed aid, as they had lost all their properties, and most of their family members had been killed. So what you see here is basically the territory of Hungary divided into the so-called deportation zones, and this shows basically from which part of Hungary the people were deported first. It's actually the yellow part, and how the whole process went on. And let's go forward. So now I will turn to the restitution process, which basically started with the armistice with the Soviet Union. It was signed on the 20th of January 1945, and later on enacted as Act 5. And paragraph number 5 said that all former restrictive laws must be annulled, which basically paved the way for restitution too. Decree 200 of 1945 stated that all anti-Jewish laws and decrees were withdrawn, and this also created a legal basis for the compensation later on. And the most important decree in the process was number 300 of 1946, which said that survivors have the right to claim their Aryanized property. However, it concerned only those goods which were lost after the German occupation, so nothing between 1934 and 1944. 1938 and 1944. Only those properties could be claimed whose new proprietors knew about their origins, so basically we have a principle of good faith here, and goods, and I quote, necessary for living, unquote, such as furniture, clothes, etc., could not be reclaimed. Yes, we sense that these were basically the things that Jews needed the most when they wanted to restart their lives. In case a valuable could not be found, the person who obtained it first was obliged to pay compensation, except if the property had been destroyed or lost due to the war. So what we see here is that basically all of these clauses were in favor of the non-Jewish proprietors. The next main law which concerned restitution was Act 25 of 1946, whose title was Condemning the Persecution of the Hungarian Jews and Easing its Consequences. This law confirmed the annulment of former anti-Jewish laws and decrees, and it said that a Jewish fund must be set up which would inherit all as Jewish property, and the law acknowledged the right to restitution. However, here is an excerpt from the law. The National Assembly of Hungary establishes that the measures based on the alien influence of fallen regimes, which deprived a part of the country's population of its rights, based on their Israelite faith or Jewish origin, they are in conflict with the eternal ideals of humanity, the moral mindset of the Hungarian people, and the spirit of Hungarian law. So basically, this law glossed over Hungarian responsibility for the Holocaust and blamed everything on the Germans and the anti-Semitic Arrow Cross Party, which came to power much later after the deportations. The state was thus not obliged to provide restitution, as it was not responsible for the suffering of the Hungarian Jews. And of course, like this, the survivors did not have any kind of legal background to claim their goods. So what we see here is that many laws and decrees did not take into account the Jews' special situation and thus serve the interests of the non-Jews. The survivors often could not find their properties on their own, or the non-Jews were not willing to give those back, and several valuables changed owners many times during this short period of time, so it was very difficult to trace them. Right after the war, there were two important institutions which handled Jewish property. The first one was established already in 1945, and its name was the Government Commission for Abandoned Property. They were supposed to handle every kind of property that was left without an owner or heir. This included also officials who fled after the war because they were anti-Semites and took part in the Holocaust, and also the Hungarian ethnic Germans who were relocated from Hungary during 1946 to 1948. And the title or name of this institution, which contained abandoned property, this was actually a common phrase at the time, but to me it implies that confiscated or looted Jewish assets were merely left behind, and thus appropriating them was not equivalent to theft. In case a valuable could not be found, this government commission provided only rented goods to the claimant, and it did not give any restitution to the survivors, nor did it help them find their properties. Therefore, its functioning was very problematic. In 1947, the National Jewish Restitution Fund was established, and it partially took over the role of the Government Commission. And the Paris Peace Treaty was one of the major driving forces behind the establishment of the fund, because it said that Hungary must provide restitution and compensation to Holocaust survivors. This fund was supposed to get heirless Jewish property and by selling it, aid the survivors who were in need. However, due to the coming socialism in Hungary, this fund never fulfilled its purpose. And now let's turn to my case studies. The first one is about József Worzel's furniture. In April 1945, József Worzel, a Holocaust survivor, reported Mrs. István Fischler to the Újpest police. And I quote from the letter of the police's letter, which they sent to the municipality where Mrs. Fischler lived. József Worzel reported at the police of Újpest Mrs. István Fischler, at whose place in Alsógöd he, belonging to the Jewish race, had been in hiding during the Arrow-Cross era. He had been forced to escape in June 1944, and he had left his furniture in Mrs. Fischler's house, which he now reclaimed. Mrs. Fischler stated that the movables had been transported partially to Germany, partially to Újpest, to Balog's house. According to Béla Balog, Mrs. Fischler did not bring any furniture to his place. According to the denouncer, his damage is 40,000 pengő. So what you need to know about the background of this case is that József Worzel was born in Újpest. He worked as a tanner, and in 1941 he was deported to Kameniec-Podolsk. This was a kind of premature deportation in Hungary, which was organized by the Hungarian officials at the time, and he managed to escape and come back to Hungary. Therefore, in 1944, when the Germans entered Hungary, he already suspected what was going to happen, and therefore he hid his valuable furniture and also found a hiding place at Mrs. Fischler's house. The value of this furniture is close to his house's value, actually, and even considering the post-war inflation, this was a very large sum, so it is not a wonder that he wanted to save this furniture from the German looting. It is unclear whether Mrs. Fischler received any kind of compensation for hiding and rescuing Worzel, but she risked, according to the laws, 6 months in prison for hiding a Jewish person. We don't get to know from the sources what the fate of the furniture was, but we can deduct it from this source. Either Béla Balogh stole it, and he was lying to the authorities, or Mrs. Fischler was lying to the authorities, and she herself wanted to keep this furniture or had sold it to someone in the meantime. This was actually a very common phenomenon in the case of rescue during the Holocaust, because the rescuers often did not get anything from the rescued people, and therefore they felt entitled to some kind of reward, in quotation marks, in exchange for their efforts. And of course, after the war, many non-Jews who safeguarded Jewish belongings lied about them or simply did not want to give them back to the original owners. So therefore, even though József Forzel managed to save his valuables during the Holocaust, he lost them again after the war. The second case is about the Popper printing house, which was a very famous printing house in between the two world wars. Ernő Popper opened this printing house in the beginning of the 20th century, and he was printing the works of very famous poets and writers between the two wars. His whole family was basically involved in the printing house's work, his children, László and Therese, his husband, also. However, due to the anti-Jewish laws, of course, the validity of Ernő Popper's trade certificate was questioned, and the family's work was rendered very difficult. In 1944, the value of the printing house and the merchandise inside it was 102,000 penge. Just to for comparison, an average house cost 20,000 to 40,000 penge at that time. By this time, a part of the assets that were kept there had been seized by the gendarmerie due to an anonymous report against the family. The authorities locked up the printing house, and some months later, they started to redistribute the merchandise found in it, including printed books. The family members, what we know about their fate is that men were called to military labor service, the women and the children were ghettoized in Monor and deported. Ernő Popper and his wife and his daughter Therese were killed in Auschwitz. László Popper, his son, was liberated in the copper mines of Bor, which today belong to Serbia, and he returned to Monor and reclaimed the printing house. He started to operate the printing house together with Therese's widowed husband, Dezső Gross. What we know from the sources is that the building had been damaged during the war. However, they got this establishment back relatively easily, as it was quite well known that it belonged to the family. In 1949, however, the printing house was nationalized by the Communist Party, and 4 years later, all of the machines were taken to another printing house, and the Popper printing house was closed for good. László Popper worked in a stationery shop in the same village or little town until 1969, but he was not allowed to work in the family's own stationery shop. And as a kind of compensation, in 1993, he was chosen an honorary citizen of Monor. So the example of this family and the printing house shows that even though a family or a survivor could get back his family's property, later on they could lose it again due to during the socialist period and due to the nationalizations. And my final case is from Újpest, which is was very close to Budapest. Today it's a part of Budapest, and there was a very big Jewish community. They comprised approximately 20% of the local population before the Holocaust, of course. And therefore, there were many survivors as well. After the war, I found many restitution letters among the Újpest documents, and most of these restitution cases were initiated by the survivors' letters, which they wrote to the municipal leadership. Most of these letters, they claimed basic items for restarting their lives, such as furniture, clothing, etc. However, in some cases, we can find mentions of family silverware, precious metal objects, or very valuable furniture as well. And the mayor, who was Sándor Szalai at the time, he mostly supported these individual efforts and ordered the non-Jewish possessors to hand the valuables back. There's a great variety of outcomes of these cases. Sometimes the two parties managed to negotiate and make an agreement. Other times, the law enforcement was needed, and in other times, they had to initiate legal cases. One of these cases I found was that of Cilla Tabak, who, for instance, wanted to get back, besides the regular household items, silver cups, silver plates, and the tapestry which belonged to her family. And according to the proceedings, in February 1945, she denounced István Tantosi, to whom she had given these items for safekeeping and who did not want to give them back when she returned. So this was a kind of usual situation. The non-Jews were retaining the Jewish goods, and they often thought that the Jews would not come back and started to use them as their own. And since the Jews were deported and they came back basically penniless, they did not have any kind of proof to prove that these had belonged to them. From the proceedings, it turns out that Tantosi even gave some of these items to his sister-in-law, which means that they really handled them as their own property. In early March, the two were pressed by the authorities to give back Cilla Tabak's property, and another proceeding testifies that it actually happened, so she was given back her property. In another case, the Rosenthal brothers wrote a letter to the mayor. They spent 2.5 years in military labor service. Their family had been deported and their house had been looted, so they could not find their own property. And they were searching it in their neighborhood but could not find anything. They asked for a walnut wood furniture, which was probably very similar to what they had owned before the war. And the Újpest Jewish Committee, a kind of self-representative body which participated in the negotiations with the local government, they supported this request. However, the mayor wrote on the other side of the letter that your request cannot be fulfilled, which means that the local administration did not undertake to look for the valuables, and if something was not declared by the non-Jewish possessors, the survivors who had no other tools to acquire these properties. Usually the mayor supported the requests, however in this case the request was very special and probably two valuable items were asked, which he could not support. We also have to mention that some of these cases belong to very early restitution cases, so even before the laws were passed. And what we see here is how the local authorities tried to make right between Jews and non-Jews after the dispossession of the Jewish population. And now I come to my conclusion. So what we can say is that the Hungarian restitution process was unfortunately a failure because the recovery of national economy was more important than the restitution of Jewish property, and the democratic parties themselves also received Jewish properties. And there were many complications, like some of these properties were changed owners twice or more times by the time the survivors came back, so it was impossible to trace them, and non-Jews were not willing to hand the Jewish property back. And even though former anti-Jewish laws were withdrawn and the legal possibility for restitution was created, there was no state support for the survivors. This resulted in anti-Jewish sentiments in the population because the Jews wanted to or tried to get back their properties themselves. The restitution mostly depended on local factors, the relations between Jews and non-Jews, and the benevolence of the authorities. And there were various institutions involved in this process despite the government's centralizing efforts. As a result, many Jews never got back their pre-war properties nor compensation for them. And even if they managed to get back something, they could lose it again during the socialism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Questions or comments? Na, Wojka. To the microphone.
I see. You were talking, of course, about the Hungarian Jews from the province and not from Budapest, because who were deported to Auschwitz. Yeah. They were from the province, and the great majority of them was really killed. Yes. So these 200,000 survivors, they are mainly, let's say, the Budapest Jews. Yes. This is one thing. The second thing, the Budapest Jewish society was one of the most expensive, richest societies of Jewish societies in Europe. And you did not mention something what is very important, namely the so-called golden train. Yeah. I mean the property confiscated, especially in Budapest, because they were the richest, and it was moved to Austria and to Germany. Yeah. And this is the question also of the restitution, because that's what you are talking about. They are more, let's say, objects, furniture, and things like that in the province, and partly they were very poor places. Oh yes, it's something different. So I want to ask you, what has happened with this golden train, because we know that partly that it was in Offenbach, and whether something came back to Hungary, and this was restituted to the owners in Budapest.
Yes, thank you. So this is a very good question. So yes, the Budapest Jewish community stayed in the country because Horthy stopped the deportations before they were deported. And actually, what we know about the confiscation is that this is my next research project, that the Jews had to hand in their money and precious metal items to the National Bank. And this was the same everywhere in the country, not only for Budapest Jews. So basically, all of these assets and money was held in one bank account, which means that after the war, no one knew what belonged to whom, so it was impossible to restitute them. The gold train contained some of these assets that were collected at the National Bank. And the gold train was actually sent to not Western Europe, but west from Hungary by the Aerocross party, which came to power in October 1944. And they wanted to take all of these Jewish assets and precious metal outside of the country, basically to use it for themselves and to re-establish their lives after the war from these valuables. However, there was a gendarmerie officer who took some of these valuables with himself, and some of them remained on the train. So now we have two different passes. The trucks of this gendarmerie officer were captured by the French army. What I know is that the French army gave back some of these assets. However, by the time the socialist government came to power, or the Socialist Party, sorry, and they never restituted anything, so they kept these valuables. As for the golden train, I believe it was captured by the American army, and they also did not give back much of it. So basically the Jews from whom these gold items and money were confiscated or stolen, they never get back anything from this.
Christian, the next, sorry, Konstantin.
It's not too much question as a comment, because Golden Train story, anyway, part of the American confiscated materials is detailedly described in the report of the Presidential Commission of Holocaust Assets in the United States. Train cars were intercepted and had echelon, and basically, I can say, not even looted, but appropriated by US Army, by General Mark. These cars did not contain too much of gold. They contained all possible of materials from fur coats to porcelain. Nothing was returned to Hungary after the conclusion of the activities of Presidential Commission. It was a class suit of Hungarian Jewish survivors initiated in California, and the American government paid dearly for this golden train.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Christian Vormeister.
Yes. Yeah, and the crown was in the CCP Munich. But I have three very short questions. Justice or compromise was your title, so there was no justice, but what's the compromise? That it was micro level? Second question is the comparative question. How does this relate to Yugoslavia or, for that matter, Italy? Because it's, again, an occupied, formerly allied power. So that's the question. And the third, you stressed that perpetratorship would not admit the crime, so the tendency to exculpate yourself. So this is maybe the philosophical question. Is that even possible, generally? I mean, who would consider himself to be the bad person who looted something only a year after? So what's your, let's say, horizon with regard to that?
Christian, we have only 1 minute.
Okay, I will try to answer. So the compromise part, I think it refers to the local people, because sometimes the Jews manage to make compromises with the non-Jews. I found even cases when someone moved into a Jewish house and the survivor returned, and they made a compromise that the survivor would live with her relatives until he or she manages to move out for like 1 or 2 months and find another house, because obviously Hungary was bombed and we had a shortage of houses. So these are the little things where you can find a compromise, but there was no justice, of course. I don't know about restitution in Italy, I'm sorry. So I can't really compare the two cases. And as for the admitting guilt, well, yes, you are right that right after the war it was very hard to admit it. But still, I think that at least they could have named the Arrow Cross, because everyone hated the Arrow Cross after the war. They were the extreme rightist, like a very anti-Semite party which came to power at the very end, and they continued the war on the side of the Germans even when everyone knew that we will lose it. So, I mean, we could have admitted even that, at least that. But no, that law didn't. So, yeah, that's my take. But yeah, we could talk about this for hours, I would say.
So thank you very much. Now I would like to introduce Anna Holzer-Kawałko as the next speaker. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem within the International Research Training Group Belongings, Jewish Material Culture in 20th Century. She received her PhD from the University in Jerusalem in 2023 with a dissertation Vanishing Heritage, National Buildings, Cultural Heritage, and German Jewish Libraries in Postwar Czechoslovakia, which she currently prepares for publication. Anna is also the author of the monograph In Other People's Houses, Poles and Jews in Lower Silesia after 1945. It was publicated in 2022. And she's co-editor of the project or book Contested Heritage, Jewish Cultural Property after 1945. We are looking forward to your presentations.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I am very happy to be here, and I will start by taking you back in time with me to December 9th, 2004, to the library of the University of Wrocław, where an unusual event took place. On this winter's day, which finally brought to an end 2 years of diplomatic negotiations, the Saraval collection arrived in the city. Before the war, the collection had been a part of the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau. Indeed, it was one of the most valuable treasures held by this prominent German Jewish Rabbinical Institute. Now, the collection was officially transferred to the local Jewish community in Wrocław from the National Library in Prague, where it was identified in the 90s by Benjamin Richler, the head of the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts in Jerusalem. Following his discovery, the collection was claimed by the Jewish community in Wrocław, which was helped during the restitution negotiations by the Polish diplomats on the one hand, and the Commission for Art Recovery on the other. It took about 2 years to resolve this case, and on the 150th anniversary of the inauguration of seminary in Breslau, the collection was handed over to the Polish president, Aleksander Kwaśniewski. At this point, it had already attracted both scholarly and public attention. Several articles in the press celebrated a diplomatic victory of the Polish authorities, and some provenance researchers and scholars focused mostly on the unique incunabula included in this collection. But back then I was struck by something else. When looking at this important part of the German Jewish culture heritage in the Polish Wrocław, where almost no trace of its former owners was left after the annexation of the region to Poland in the early post-war years, I could not resist the feeling that there was something unsettling in this publicly proclaimed successful homecoming. Something paradoxical in the celebrated journey of Breslau treasure to Wrocław that back then no one seemed to notice. And this very feeling led me to ask what happened to the cultural property, libraries in particular, of the German Jewish communities in Lower Silesia during, but especially after, the Second World War. And it took many years of research, surprisingly many, to answer this seemingly simple question. And the outcome is this very book, which explores, among others, the fate of the books from the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau in post-war Poland as a kind of representative case. I'm very happy that it will appear in German translation next month, and today I would like to share with you some of the findings from this work. And let's start maybe with a short historical background on the library. The library of the Breslau Rabbinical Seminary was really one of the most important cultural assets, not only in Lower Silesia, but also in pre-war Germany on the whole. The library came into being in 1854 alongside the seminary, These two institutions shared the same building on Wallstraße in Breslau. The foundation of the library was laid with the purchase of the very same Saraval collection, which consisted of 405 books, including 69 manuscripts and 6 incunabula, held originally by a renowned collector, Leon Vita Saraval of Trieste. Throughout the library's existence, these books constitute the most valuable part of its collection, which grew rapidly as the library received additional donations and really expanded in different directions. In 1937, the library's collection contained about 40,000 volumes, including 433 manuscripts and 54 incunabula. As was the case of other Jewish libraries in Germany, the turning point in the history of the Breslau Library came with the Nazi Party's rise to power. A significant part of the library was destroyed during the November pogrom of 1938, and it is likely that already at that point some of the books that were thrown into the street were moved to Berlin, but the rest remain in the seminary building until July 1939, when it was seized by the Gestapo and then transported to Berlin, where the library was incorporated into the collections of the Reich Main Security Office. Sometime later, Part of the Breslau collection was further dispersed between different institutions in the Reich, but the bulk of the collection remained in Berlin. And finally, in August 1943, as the front drew closer to Germany's capital, the Breslau library was divided into several parts, which were then evacuated to various locations in the German province, including Sudetenland, Theresienstadt ghetto camp, and Lower Silesia. Now, after 1945, the fate of the different parts of the Breslau library depended to a large extent on the location where they were rediscovered. For instance, the parts of the Breslau collection that were found by the American military were moved to the Offenbach archival depot, and from there, via Jewish cultural reconstruction, to numerous Jewish bodies in Switzerland, Palestine, England, the United States, and even Mexico. The parts that were found in the territory of postwar Czechoslovakia were largely transferred to Palestine by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, but again, some remained in Prague and are in Prague even until today. These transfers definitely deserve more attention, and I studied them extensively. Will be happy to get back to them maybe during the Q&A, but today I would like to zoom in on the Breslau books that were found back, quite ironically, in their home region, in Lower Silesia. At the end of the war, parts of the Breslau library were discovered in 3 different locations in Lower Silesia, which, and this is of course crucially important, was being now annexed by Poland and whose German population was being brutally expelled at exactly the same time. The fate of the collection found in each of these locations reflects well the variety of conditions that shaped the status of German Jewish cultural heritage in Poland after the war. And we will go one by one. So the first location was a castle in the village of Wilkanów near the Polish-Czech border. Already in May and June 1945, the soldiers of the Red Army discovered numerous Jewish books and archival documents in this castle, including those belonging to the Breslau Seminary, and subsequently they took them to Moscow as the spoils of war, along with thousands of other cultural treasures that Soviet forces looted from the Germans in these territories. The transfer of the collections to the Soviet Union testifies not only to the wide scope of the Soviet plunder, this is of course a well-known story, I would say, but also to the fundamental lack of distinction between German and German Jewish property that characterized not only the agenda of the Soviet military forces, but what I am interested in, the post-war politics in the former German territories in general. And as a result of this particular blindness, the latter, the German Jewish property, was actually plundered twice, firstly by the Nazis and secondly by the Soviet trophy brigades, and its lack fundamental protection from the Polish authorities back at the time. Until today, 39 items from the Breslau library have been identified in Russia, 16 of them stored in the Russian State Military Archives and 23 in the Russian State Library. Another part of the Breslau library was found in the apartment of a resident of Bytom-Odrzański, so completely different story. It remains unclear how the items came into the possession of a Polish gardener in the city. Perhaps he simply discovered them by chance or received them from someone else. The archival record reveals only that before the re-emerging Jewish community in Silesia could dispatch its representative to the place, the men sold all the books, and I quote, apparently to a Jew who appeared 2 weeks before us and paid 12,000 zlotys for 2 boxes and a suitcase with Jewish manuscripts and books, end of quotation. After the purchase, both the buyer and the books disappeared without a trace. During this period, Lower Silesia served as a transit point for hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors on their way to the West. It is possible that the collections from Bytom-Odrzański left with one of these migrants. Here, it is important to note that in a broader context, if we consider the Jewish book market in Poland at the time, this case was not at all unusual. On the contrary, in the first years after the Holocaust, many Jewish book collections, and especially those that remained without owners, were traded by numerous individuals who found them scattered throughout the country. And if we look at the materials documenting the establishment or re-establishment of Jewish libraries in post-war Poland, for instance, we may find many accounts describing dealings with private booksellers, to mention at least that of Barbara Bermanova, the moving spirit behind the creation of a library at the Central Committee of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which would later turn into the library of today's Jewish Historical Institute, and this is a really telling example. I quote, "In March of 1945, a bookseller approached the Jewish committee in Warsaw and offered Jewish books for sale. For almost a whole month, he tried to draw the interest of the committee members, but to no avail. I, on the other hand, sought to find out about his address, but no one wrote it down. When he finally reached me, he was already very disappointed with the ongoing negotiations and asked me to take the books immediately and pay him 30 zlotys per volume. However, that day, I didn't have the means to purchase the collection, and thus I asked him to postpone the sale until the next day. When I arrived for the second time, the books had already been sold. They were taken by a private buyer who paid in cash. Thus, the library lost some very valuable books." End of quotation. And such cases point to the great significance of pure luck, I would say, of chance, as a factor determining the fate of Jewish libraries, those in Silesia, in Poland in general after the war. In the chaos that prevailed in Poland in the early post-war months and in some regions even years, the fate of the rediscovered Nazi-looted Jewish books was shaped to a large extent not by a clear and consistent policy of state bodies or Jewish organizations which may be found in the archival records, but rather by lack thereof, by coincidence, by twist of fate and spontaneous decisions of individuals. And this maybe should change the way of our thinking about new potential informal oral sources for the study of Jewish books of the fate after the war in Poland. And finally, in early 1947, a bulk of the books and manuscripts from the Breslau Rabbinical Seminary was discovered in the village Trzebieszowice, near Kłodzko. Following this discovery, a collection of some 20,000 items was taken over by the local Jewish community in Kłodzko, which informed about the discovery two different Jewish bodies. The first was the Jewish Committee in Wrocław, which served as a kind of umbrella organization for all of Jewish, this time of course Polish Jewish communities in Lower Silesia. And the second was the Silesian branch of the rather well-known today body, Central Jewish Historical Commission, which sought to document the Nazi crimes and the extermination of Polish Jewry. Both bodies sent their representatives to Kłodzko, and their visits provide us with some valuable insights into this collection. We know, for instance, that among the identified items were archival materials from the Jewish communities in Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and Warsaw, as well as a significant portion of the library of the Breslau Seminary, including a number of rare incunabula. And I quote, "The Kunzendorf collection is of particularly great value," read the report submitted to the Central Jewish Historical Commission. "In addition to books, it contains many manuscripts from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries," end of quote. The report further recommended taking immediate steps to ensure the transfer of these treasures to the Commission. However, in the meantime, the Jewish Committee in Wrocław decided to move the collection from Kłodzko to its premises and to incorporate it into the library that was supposed to be established there, on Włodkowica Street, which was pre-war Wallstrasse, the original home of the Rabbinical Seminary. The transfer of the collection to Wrocław provoked strong opposition from the members of the Historical Commission in turn, who claimed that the representatives of Wrocław Committee appropriated the treasures and even accused them, and I quote, that they tried to hide the matter and claimed that the collection came from somewhere else, end of quotation. This conflict was eventually resolved by Nachman Blumenthal, the first chairman of the Jewish Historical Institute that was supposed to be opened in Warsaw in the fall of the same year, 1947, who demanded to receive the collection for the institute, to include it, and I quote again, into the central archives of Polish Jewry. Following this demand, in early 1948, a representative of the Institute was sent to Wrocław to transfer the collections to Warsaw. For many years, the German Jewish books from Breslau were one of the most valuable treasures held by the Institute, and this might be perhaps a reason why the incorporation of the German Jewish heritage into an archive with a distinct, I would say, national character, if ironic from the historical perspective, did not raise any objections from people involved in the matter. At the same time, despite their enormous value, the Breslau books were rarely used or displayed. Already in 1949, Barbara Bermanova, who was then the Institute's chief librarian, reported that the library includes, and I quote, many Jewish books in foreign languages, especially German, that have not been even catalogued until now. Most of the books belong to the library of the Rabbinical Seminary in Breslau and are not useful under our conditions, end of quote. Finally, the clearest expression of their marginalization was an incident that occurred during the following decade, when the most important part of the Breslau collection in Warsaw, the incunabula, was lost under unclear circumstances. And currently we know that at least some of them were smuggled to Jerusalem in the late 50s with the help of the Institute's director, Bernd Bernard Mark, and of the Israeli diplomats in Warsaw, and then incorporated into the collections of the Jewish National and University Library. You can see the building on Givat Ram, which was more than happy to strengthen its position as an intellectual successor of Breslau Jewry, and again, I will be happy to expand on this very point during the Q&A. But in contrast, at the Institute in Warsaw, this loss was not even felt for a long time, until an internal investigation was initiated in the 80s. The disappearance of Breslau incunabula was brought to the public attention in Poland only many years later by Krzysztof Pilarczyk, a historian from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, who, while preparing a survey of Jewish incunabula in the Polish libraries, visited the Institute and, to his surprise, found none of them in his collections. And this quiet disappearance of the Breslau incunabula from the Jewish Historical Institutes reflect, I argue well, the fate of German Jewish cultural heritage in Poland after the war. Following the change of borders, the transfer of populations, and the radical homogenization of Polish society, this heritage, even if again in the Jewish hands, did not find its successors in a real sense of this word and became simply incomprehensible. The re-established Jewish community in Poland lacked the necessary tools, financial means, political conditions, and perhaps also the will to understand and appreciate these valuable remains of German Jewish heritage that fell into their hands. The history of the Breslau books in post-war Poland thus highlights precisely the loss that was brought upon the German Jewish world in Silesia in the wake of the Holocaust. And finally, this case points to the importance of incorporating socio-political history into the provenance research of Jewish libraries, of Jewish cultural property in Poland, but also in Eastern Europe more broadly. Specifically, I think it demonstrates that the particular trajectory of the socio-cultural transformation of post-war Eastern Europe towards a radical ethnic homogenization should serve as a necessary background for the examination of the fate of Jewish cultural property in this region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dziękuję. Thank you. Konstantin, the first, and then.
Thank you very much for extremely interesting report. I was responsible in the Commission for Art Recovery for all operations connected with Breslau Library. We, of course, started in Moscow, and Moscow has very interesting elements, the Moscow story, which I will be happy to share with you after the conference, which were connected with the predecessor of Karl Marx, who were studying in the rabbinical seminary, which created special problems, and that part of the library, which was in Moscow, in the former Lenin Library, now Russian State Library, was super classified because of Marx-related documentation. Returning to the Czech part of the library, Serval collection, which was restituted to Poland. I don't know when Richter discovered it, but when we were searching for it, we did not have any information about its location. We, in a sense, found this library thanks for tips given by Patricia Kennedy Grimstead, who found some French articles of the beginning of the 50s indicating that materials from Silesia could be taken to Prague. In Prague, authorities for practically 1 year refused to recognize and to disclose the location of the library, which was disclosed in a very peculiar way and in the last moment, and the story I will be happy to share with you too. Return to the library to Wrocław, of course, is a complicated issue, which obviously has a political connotation, like all restitutions connected to the new Polish territories, which is, again, a story which is much bigger than just existence of the Jewish-Polish community, which is worth of further discussion too, like all cross-claims to the materials from new Polish territories, which we experience again and again. I just want to mention an example, vellum in the National, in the Library of Congress in Washington, for years and years, claimed by both Germany and Poland. But thank you very much. It's very, very interesting material.
Thank you for your comment. Kamil Seidler.
May I only add something? Thank you very much. I would be delighted to discuss it. And I just want to highlight that all this broader background that you now mentioned, what I am interested in how it played out in the history of the German Jewish heritage in Poland. And I think that it is here, what is particularly striking and important to say that it made this fate very, very tragic. That even though the library survived, a significant part of survived, it again seemingly ended up in the Jewish hand. But again, what is the meaning of this heritage if no one makes use of it, if no one understands it? No? So these are the kind of paradoxes that I am interested in. And thank you very much for outlining the broader context for this.
Kamil Seidler from Gdansk.
Good morning, Kamil Seidler, University of Gdańsk. Dear Anna, of course I do appreciate your research and presentation. However, we are here not only to accept, but also to argue. And I have to say that I totally do not accept your conclusions. Because in the field of public international law, we have a quite simple answer for the question raised by you, and the answer is the argument from the territorial affiliation. And I highly recommend the book by Andrzej Jakubowski, published by the Oxford University Press a few years ago. And this is amazing research in the field of the change of the borders and the legal consequences in the field of restitutions. It was the PhD in EUI under the supervision of Francesco Franchioni, very famous public international lawyer. So the answer is clear. For example, the Polish heritage is in Ukraine, in Belarus, and we have to accept it. One of the biggest Polish collection of works of art is in Lvov, which is under the attack now, and there have been even propositions to move it temporarily to Poland, based on the 1954 convention to save it as a Polish cultural heritage, as well as Breslau, of course, and my city, Danzig, I was born there. It is also the part of German cultural heritage, and we accept it. We are proud of it. So the simple, if we try to find a simple answer that we should relocate an object because of the cultural affiliation and so on, I think it's a wrong way of thinking about the restitutions in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wait a second, because I have no problem with people who don't agree with me, the opposite. I look for them because it challenges me on the intellectual level, but I just want to understand with what exactly you do not agree, right? Because like international, let's come to the international law. In the case that I was discussing here, the law did not play any role in the 1945-47 movement of the Breslau Library. The opposite, part of them disappeared from the Jewish Historical Institute. They were just moved by private people. So I just want to understand with what part you do not agree, what I was saying.
I do not accept the thesis that you said that should be located in the library. The library you mentioned at the end of your presentation.
Okay, this is a very important point. I never argue, and I don't want to argue that the place of this heritage, like that there is a right place for the Breslau heritage. I think that that this is part of the tragic fate of its library, yes, that there are many places who claim this heritage.
As well, you said that there are no more continuity about the rabbinic seminar in Breslau. There is no, but there are still the Jewish community over there. But you said that they are not as important to keep it, to preserve it.
No,
you said no money, no sources,
what
no
I
interest.
said that after the war, yes, there was no money, no sources, no interest. And if you look at 45 and 47, there was no money, no interest, no people, no tools to understand, and also other priorities for those Polish Jews who were trying to establish themselves in post-war Poland. So the hierarchy of priorities was obviously different, and the German Jewish heritage was not at the top. This was
I don't want to interrupt, but I have to do it.
Yes.
Last question, Wojka Cieślińska-Lobkowicz.
I want to come back to Płocko, and let's say that this Jewish, the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary was there, and it was moved to Warsaw, to Jewish Historical Institute. The problem is, of course, that let's say the communities, the Jewish communities in Płocko and Lower Silesia, they were, of course, let's say, post-war Jewish communities, mainly of Jews who repatriated from Soviet Union, who survived, I mean Polish Jews. And the problem is, for example, that the restitution of the Saraval collection in 2004 to Breslau, or to Wrocław, is so far interesting that, let's say, the Jewish community in Wrocław, which received it back, this is not the legal successor of the Breslau Jewish community, I mean the pre-war Jewish community. But I suppose that all these stories which you started now, we can better discuss together with this lost library of lost books, what's going on and how to connect them, divided into very different places, I mean, in Jerusalem or in New York or somewhere, or in Switzerland, in the case of Jewish Theological Seminary. And we have here the new director of Jewish Historical Institute, who has some ideas about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojka, again, for outlining this broader context. And what I just maybe want to say at the very end, that indeed the Breslau library is one of many cases of German Jewish libraries that were dispersed during the war and dislocated beyond the geographical borders of Germany. And this dislocation made their fate after the war very complicated and left it with no simple answers. I really will be happy to discuss it maybe during the breaks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our third speaker is Jana Jirásková. She is the head of the Documentation Center for Property Transfers of the Cultural Assets of World War II Victims of the Czech Republic since 2023. She already has been working at the Documentation Center since 2013. She focuses her work on the ongoing restitutions of cultural property seized during the Second World War and on research concerning the mechanism of confiscation of cultural assets in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, the subsequent transfers of this property, including post-war transfers. And she was also involved in the organization of exhibitions and conferences, like the last in September 2024. Some of the colleagues present here today also took part in the conference Transferred to Reich Ownership. Máte slovo, Jana.
Dear colleagues, at the very beginning, I would also like to thank to the German Lost Art Foundation for organizing this event and for the invitation. In my presentation, I will focus on the restitution practice in the territory of the current or the present-day Czech Republic, because the Slovak National Council, which proclaimed itself the only legislative and executive body for the territory, did not give its consent to the nationwide application of some of the regulations. Also, while this topic is very complex, I initially decided to just provide a basic overview, only to find out that the presentation was almost 1 hour long. So finally, I limit myself to reviewing only the most basic aspects of the process and a single illustrative example. In general, the restitution practice in post-war Czechoslovakia was influenced by a number of factors. The Jews were initially supported by the state, but it was soon to change with the increasing role of the Soviet Union and the deterioration of its stance towards the State of Israel. The social climate in post-war Czechoslovakia was fundamentally different from that of Masaryk's first Czechoslovak Republic. The trauma of war did not necessarily eliminate prejudices. In some cases it even amplified them. And many also welcomed the egalitarian reforms promoted by the Communist Party, which had a strong position in both government and society even before the communist coup in February 1948. And this affected the restitutions, as those depended also on the attitude of the officials of lower administrative bodies, who could either help the restitution process or condemn it to failure. And this was further supported by the pressure to rebuild the state after the war and associated nationalization of property. The result was that only some Jewish claimants received their property back, depending also on the type and value of the property. The restitution of cultural assets was governed by the more general decree of the President of the Republic, number 5 of May 1945. The decree set up a so-called national administration of property of those entities that were considered to be unreliable. These included German and Hungarian state and legal entities, but also persons of German and Hungarian nationality. At the same time, the decree declared null and void property transfers that had been made under duress during the occupation or as a result of national, racial, or political persecution. The fundamental restitution law was Act number 128 of 1946. Importantly, it was a general law. It dealt not only with Jewish restitution and not only with restitution of cultural assets. This law established a 3-year period for making the claim and monetary compensation for property that could not be returned. It also defined the term unreliable person in more detail, and these were excluded from restitution. Exceptions under which, for instance, persons of German nationality would not be considered as unreliable included those who could prove that they had remained loyal, had never committed a crime against the Czech and Slovak nations, and moreover had fought for liberation of Czechoslovakia or had suffered under the Nazi terror. These regulations thus had a major impact on the restitution of Jewish property, since many Czechoslovak Jews had claimed German nationality before the war, simply because German was the language they commonly used. After the war, the effect was that they had to prove their national and state reliability. And I will come back to this issue again. In June of 1945, the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare set up an office to administer the property confiscated to the victims of the Second World War. You can see its name on the slide, but well, it is rather long, and I will therefore use the Czech abbreviation NSMP, under which it can be traced in the Czech documents. The NSMP took over both movable and immovable property of 3 key entities. These were the Property Authority, operating by the Reich Protector's Office during the war, the Immigration Fund of the Central Office for Jewish Immigration, and the Jewish Council of Elders, whose department, the Treuhandstelle, was forced to operate the depots in which the property of deported protectorate Jews was stored. The main task of the NSMP was the restitution of the property and the search for the original owners. They published lists of the names of those whose property had been identified. Interviews were also conducted with the former employees of the Treuhandstelle to find out whether the transport numbers still present on some items could serve as a sufficient proof of ownership. Claimant could be the original owner, his or her family, even extended one, or testamentary heirs. And they had to provide a certificate of nationality, state reliability, and state citizenship. Relatives had to prove their ties to the original owner and provide the declaration of the owner's death. And detailed description was often required from the claimant and preferably witnesses. Indeed, the restitutions were initiated. This example document reports items of total worth of about 1.5 million Czechoslovak crowns, returned in the second half of 1947 from 2 of the NSMP depots, but out of total worth of 8 million. However, it is not possible at present to make a full assessment of restitutions, as the archival material relating to the activities of the NSMP has been only partially processed. While the restitutions were ongoing till the 1950s, or the very early 1950s, the situation was certainly not idyllic. I will now mention the main problems related to the work of the NSMP, followed by the main legal challenges. The main problem was locating the assets scattered in various institutions and repositories. Museums and galleries were supposed to provide inventories of the Jewish property deposited with them, either by the original owners or by the occupation authorities. However, the institutions themselves often did not have complete records, and they sometimes withheld some items in their custody. The slowness may also have been due to the quality of the staff of the NSMP, whose management even complained in its 1946 annual report that its office was not a shelter for those less able or completely unable of work. The fact is that until the communist takeover in February 1948, many items were not found. And after that, restitution, especially of valuable assets, was very complicated and very rare. Perhaps the most limiting factor in the NSMP's work was the gradual increase in political and ideological pressure on its activities. In April of 1948, the NSMP was instructed to liquidate the property that could not be restituted, items that had no identifying features. The valuable pieces were transferred to state ownership, and the rest of the items were sold at auction. The office officially ceased its activities in March of 1950, and the same procedure followed with the remaining, even identifiable items. Now, the legal challenges. The legal norms, as drafted, may have provided a fundamentally acceptable basis for redressing property injustices, but the official practice was often very different from the theory. The authorities assessed the claimant's social class and whether the restitution would change it. After February 1948, the refusal of restitution was often justified on the grounds that the return of large and valuable property to a private owner would be contrary to the social order and economic system of the people's democratic state. The fundamental problem limiting the restitution of Jewish property was the question of the national and state reliability of those who claimed German or Hungarian nationality in the last pre-war census in 1930. These people fell under the category of unreliable entities. A further problem was that, say, German nationality was associated with the loss of Czechoslovak citizenship, one of the requirements for the restitution. Although the decree of August 1945 regulating Czechoslovak citizenship specifically defined the group of people who were to retain the citizenship, and the vast majority of the Jewish claimants met these criteria, the decision depended on the official claimant encountered. And there is ample evidence that the claimants were met with reluctance. The staff of the national committees investigated whether the person in question had been guilty of crimes against the Czech or Slovak people. And in this context, the accusation of participation in Germanization was used. Well, the proofs of Germanization was often not only truly absurd, but in clear contradiction to the definitions given by the law. Just one example. The National Committee in the Prague's district of Břevnov, very, very lucrative quarter, used a list of subscribers to the German theater to prove Germanization. The other administrative conditions often misused to complicate the process included, for example, the declaration of death, because to claim a deceased relative's property, the applicants had to wait up to a year for the court to officially declare the person dead. Many Jewish assets were misclassified as enemy property and confiscated, with some even taken abroad by the Red Army as trophy property. And property acquired in good faith was legally protected, but the court proceedings dragged on for a very long time and were often never resolved before the communist coup. After the communist takeover, the previously mentioned problems amplified. And moreover, at the beginning of April 1948, the Act 128 was amended, complicating the restitution on the ground of public interest. Authorities also often questioned the legal status of claimants living abroad, using it as ground to block restitution, and restitution claims were also denied by citing unpaid taxes. In principle, the law became an instrument of political will, and the hearing of individual cases was deliberately delayed and in the end often stopped altogether, as in the case of Richard Moravec, which I will now discuss. Richard Moravec was the head of a textile factory in Úpice, and he also had a large and very valuable art collection. He emigrated at the very beginning of the occupation, and following an agreement with the then director of the State Collection of Old Masters, which is now the National Gallery, he deposited his collection in the institution. In September of 1939, the Gestapo declared his collection forfeited to the Reich, but it remained in the gallery. After 1945, Richard Moravec applied for the restitution of his property. In the case of the art collection, the main objective was the recognition of his ownership and the cancellation of the Gestapo's confiscation order. In August of 1946, his right of ownership was restored. In March 1947, the management of the gallery clearly stated that there could be no objection against the restitution, since Richard Moravec had voluntarily deposited the collection in the gallery, and it was therefore loaned property. In May 1947, Moravec applied for the restitution of his collection in accordance with the Decree No. 5 and Act No. 128. In late November of 1947, the Ministry of Finance issued a decree revoking the Gestapo's confiscation order. However, this was the very last friendly step. In 1948, the gallery began to repeatedly draw attention to two things: that Richard Moravec lived abroad, and the value of the collection, and the fact that it should have served the public. The gallery therefore proposed to raise an objection of public interest against the restitution. However, it was rejected by the Financial Prosecutor's Office on the ground that in this case the compensation should have been paid to the owner, which would no longer be so much in public interest, given the value of the collection. In December of 1949, the gallery therefore asked the Ministry of the Interior to investigate whether Richard Moravec was still a Czechoslovak citizen. If so, he should have been asked to return. At the same time, the gallery asked the Ministry of Finance to find out whether Moravec paid all his taxes. And you can see the letters here. It is the very same date, similar text. The only difference is the request: taxes, citizenship. As early as March of 1950, the Ministry of Finance ordered to confiscate the collection on the grounds of unpaid property taxes, despite simultaneously requesting an assessment, indicating that they did not yet know how much he owed, but they confiscated the whole collection worth millions. Another evidence, because this was not enough, Another evidence for the confiscation of his property was the accusation of Germanization. This was used despite the documented fact that the entire family claimed Czechoslovak nationality in the 1930 census. The pretext was that he employed some Germans in his factory. Noteworthy to mention that it was only logical, as it was located in the region with mixed population. Úpice was at the very border of the protectorate. Eventually, the decree of the Ministry of Finance of November 1947, the one abolishing the confiscation by the Gestapo, was revoked. As a result, Morawiec's ownership, which had been recognized, was invalidated, and the ownership of the German Reich was restored. All the property was then confiscated again as enemy property. Well, this case illustrates the changes in the attitudes of the authorities with regard to the restitution. While the institutions were relatively cooperative immediately after the war, the situation deteriorated over time until the process was effectively halted. Thank you for your attention.
Navalka, always the first.
The very important thing is of course, 48, this is the communists are coming, so the time between 45 and 48, February 48, this is a different, this is
well, it
different
was not,
situation.
there were still pressures from the government because the Communist Party was already very strong even before the takeover.
Yes, I know, but the nationalization and so on, this is the first case. This is very important.
The nationalization actually started earlier. It started in October 1945 with nationalization of mines, monetary insurance companies, and these. It was the first phase. After the 1948, it was the second phase, which basically destroyed all the private property.
Yes and no. In one way, of course, this is, let's say, step by step, it's true. But of course, let's say the rules of 48, they are the typical communist rules.
Yes.
And we can just see it also in Poland and also in
Yes.
Hungary and so on. So, and this is, and the second thing is very important. The case of Morawiec shows something very important already from the 1945, namely, the very, very often, the proof that somebody, the Czech Jew, was a German.
Yes.
This was, let's say, the pre-war question in which language is their original language. And a lot of the Czech Jews, their language was the German one, as Kafka, yes, for example. So the problem is that they were, after 45, very often seen as Germans, yes, being, let's say, prosecuted by the Germans in protectorate.
Yes, and as I have said, the proofs of their Germanizing effect. I was talking about the theater. The interwar Czechoslovakia, the first Czechoslovak Republic, was multinational. There were Czechs, Germans, Polish, Hungarians, and various different languages were spoken throughout the country. And the Germanizing effect, well, I really doubt that the Jews attending the theater were planned to Germanize the already German theater. They just spoke German and then wanted to go to the theater, that was all. But the National Committee thought differently on purpose.
Anna, please.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. What was the most striking to me, perhaps it's obvious, is the same lack of differentiation now between German and German Jewish that I wanted to show in Lower Silesia. I think that it's really important. It's like a major characteristic for the whole region, and it exerted such a great impact on the restitution. Thank you for showing it. And I have two actual questions for you. So you show us mainly the impact of this legal framework on individual efforts at restitution, and I was wondering, what about communal ones, like the efforts taken by the Jewish communities as opposed to individual claimants? Were there any more successful or not? And the second question is about those auctions. In the late 40s, in the 50s. So here, my question would go more into the sources through which we can investigate those auctions. I must admit, I've been to Prague several times looking for my German Jewish libraries, and I found very little on the very same auction. I found only two houses that bought probably millions of books, Orbis and Vladimir Bondy, and I still remember, but what I remember from those visits is this lack of access to relevant sources, so I would be curious to know if anything changed in this matter and how we can approach those kind of transactions later on.
Yeah, I will probably start with the second question. There is no big improvement in ability to access the sources. If they are unprocessed, they are not available. We tried to have some negotiations with the archives, but well, it appeared to be more difficult than expected. As far as the auctions are concerned, we have several, but also we have several lists from various auction houses. It was Antiqua, later it was Starožitnosti, but some items were also sold by Artia company to abroad or by the Ministry of Foreign Trade, also for foreign exchanges. The lists had no proper signature, no proper cover paper, so you don't even know what time period it speaks about. So it's just a random bits and pieces of not very detailed descriptions of items. Sometimes it is just 3 glasses, portrait of a man, 1 vase. The first question about the communal property, that the Jewish communities were not also very lucky, because many houses were destroyed, or synagogues, cemeteries were destroyed. The state did not support very much the continuation of the religious life in general, and the Jewish religious life in particular. So mostly, many religious communities were ceased to exist because they had no members, they had no money. About 30 survived in the Czech lands and 13 in Moravia, but they were mostly suffering throughout the period, which get even worse after 1948, 1950s especially, because in 1950s there was a very, very bad environment for Jewish people in Czechoslovakia. Better times came in 1960s, but it was very effectively halted in 1968 with the occupation of the armies of the Warsaw Pact. So communal property restitution was not any better at all.
Is there one more question or comment? No.
Thank you.
Thank you.